Hello and welcome to our first preview for Waterline PRO version 6. So we're now super excited to show some of the new features that are coming. In this video, we're mainly going to be showcasing our Gen 4 Ocean Actor, which is like a real big next-gen solution of anything ocean related you can want, really. Now, in this case, we're using our pre-made level Atlantic, which has some really nice lighting and materials already set to go. And bit by bit, we're going to be showing some of these changes. Now, the thing to remember is that this will be a separate Ocean Actor, Gen 4. Gen 3 is still going to remain here. And the reason for this is because after the release, this version will still be up for testing as we iron out some kinks. And version 3 at the moment has been really battle tested in all sorts of animations and real-time video games, applications and all. So yeah, that's going to stay there and remain for the time being, and this will be alongside it for more advanced uses. So you're probably asking, well, what does this do? Well, let's go one by one. So initially, here transform, water mesh settings, nothing much is changing. But right now, if we quickly teleport to the bottom, we can see that the ocean simulation sort of area looks quite a bit different. Now, we've kind of blacked out a few of these settings for the time being, but we'll be going over them and revealing everything that you can do. For the time being, we have enabled ocean. Override time is something that will allow you to control time of the ocean. In fact, let's just start with this because this is a fairly small but much requested feature. So if we just enable override time here, we can see that our ocean just froze. Sequencer, which we have here, we can scroll and change the ocean timing as needed. We can play it, reverse it, and yeah. So this is pretty useful for all sorts of animations. You must make sure that live ocean is pressed because if it's paused, nothing will happen. So yeah, business as usual. You have your ocean resolution for different FFTs, but the biggest thing you might notice is that we now have no FFT settings here at the bottom. These are kind of self-contained in a brand new FFT simulation material. And at the moment, something like this. And this is pretty great because right now this can be turned into a material instance and you can transfer and drag and drop anything in this area and sort of get your different settings. So for starters, we have some pretty cool things like wind fetch, kind of elongates the waves according to the wind. We have more details here from the use micro displacement here at the bottom. We have details adjust that we can blend over. And next up, something cool that we've done is we've introduced a couple of our own very special little modifications to the FFT formula. And what these can do is add directionality. So these are something a little bit of a post-process effect almost, but they're done at the simulation stage. So for example, if we reduce the fetch to something like 2 or 1, so we get a bit more directionless ocean, and maybe increase the amplitude to something like, whoops, not 88, just 8 or maybe 10. We can start and introduce a little bit of an FFT offset. So if we go here, I'm going to write a value like 0.1 and see that our ocean is now traveling in a direction. So this is something that's pretty cool. This is, again, something that we're doing on top of the FFT simulation, more or less, but it's also done at the simulation stage. So everything like buoyancy, caustics, and foam will be affected, will follow this direction. So let's see what else we could do. Well, since our FFT simulation here is a variable, we can do something really cool. So for example, right now we're using the Philips spectrum, and that is the more or less the gold standard for movie quality and all sorts of VFX. This is what all the big sort of studios are using. But we're no longer limited to it. So for example, we could do something really cool and just drag and drop a John swap spectrum. And there we go. So right now, our John swap spectrum is again something that we have added this really cool directionality to it, because otherwise it's pretty much a basic alpha beta spectrum. Now we can open it and see that it comes with its own set of parameters. Now, these will not necessarily be the same across all because these are different spectrums. So for example, in this one you have omega, omega peak, peak enhancements, and that sort of stuff. Simulation scale works a bit differently here. So these will be things that you will need to familiarize yourself with a bit. And we can tweak the wind speed. We can increase the amount of swells, so we have bigger waves traveling in the direction. And this is our directionality here. It's done by the FFT offset. We can get rid of it, and our ocean will look a bit funky at the moment. So scale, but rather the omega power. So this is something that you would probably see in something like Blender called settled ocean or resolved ocean. And this is really good for sort of more ambient looking smaller waves. And then we can, of course, lower the speed so they aren't shimmering all the time. And yeah, so what other spectrums do we have? Because this is basically two completely different ocean simulations at the moment. Well, we also have the Pierce Moskowitz spectrum. Let me just quickly find it. And once again, we can just simply drag and drop it. And boom, there we go. A completely separate ocean simulation. Now, these are all FFT based, and when we open it, it comes with its own set of controls. So, for example, we have the standard alpha, beta, amplitude, and this sort of stuff. So this kind of controls how big swells we have, smaller swells, directionality. This one doesn't really have directionality by itself, but with our FFT offset, we can still inject some. So if we type in 0.501, we could see the waves start moving in a particular direction. So this is quite cool at the moment, but on top of all of this, we could use our additional fully on post-process changes to the ocean simulation. So we could change things like ocean wave height. So right now it's 3, we can go 5, we can go 1, 2, so forth and so forth, and so on. We can adjust the steepness, 6, 2, 1. So these are more blobby waves. These are sharper looking waves. And again, we can also adjust the foam. This is just generally how we would do it normally with the material. And would you believe it? That is actually not all, because we have something really cool to show you. Now, you saw us talk about all the different ocean spectrums, like the Phillips spectrum, the Pearson-Moskowitz spectrum, and the Jones-Swap spectrum. And what these represent are mathematical sort of formulae that describe the motion of the ocean, for lack of a better word. But until now, you'd been pretty limited to sort of only use these. Now, something that we've really wanted to do is allow users to create more or less their own spectrum. Now, the reason you may not want to do this is because the ones that are already established and added in this are based on physical observations and are more or less mapped into how oceans actually behave. But you're a madman and you want to have your own super duper custom ocean that just looks good. Well, for this we have another material called MFFT Custom Spectrum, and that looks something like this. Now, initially you have your kind of regular parameters here for simulation scale. Let's leave that at 20 for now. Spectrum scale, wave speed, wind direction that sort of rotates things a bit neater. And what else is there? Wind scale and the usual FFT offset that we can use to give directionality. But something really cool that you may have noticed is this little asset here called curve. And what we've basically done is create a blank spectrum that can be edited through an Unreal curve asset. And this is what we have here. So the red channel is basically our wave spectrum and the green is for the wind. So let's start editing our red spectrum and see what happens. So for example, the closer a value is to 0, this kind of corresponds to the larger swells. We can select this value and whoops, break things, or just carefully edit it to something like 1000. and you will see the larger waves being more flattened out. Next up, we could kind of zoom in over here and start adjusting a value like this. And you see smaller waves being generated and kind of brought up. We could bring it down to have a more evenly spaced out spectrum. So what is this spectrum? This is kind of like a bunch of sine waves, and this is the overall their aggregate amplitude, more or less. So when we lower this down, we're kind of getting rid of a certain scale of waves, or we could bump it up to something like 500 and get more. So what the current spectrums do is basically create a curve based on your inputs, whereas right now here we could manually edit this curve. For example, we want more details in the lower spectrum like here, and boom, you could see them showing up. Or actually we want to have a more realistic ocean. Maybe something along this side. No, well, we could adjust it here. So realistically, this kind of brings you an endless opportunities of the type of FFT ocean you can create for yourself. With our current setup, this is more than a basic alpha beta spectrum because you could also edit the wind as well. So let's do this. It's basically they're both basically curves between ones and zeros, and with wind influence we could kind of come up with some pretty wacky looking scenarios. The wind curve ideally is, so it should look something like this if you're being very accurate, and boy does this look better. You could see higher values sharpening up certain peaks. And for lack of a better description, what we have here at the moment is a Phillips spectrum almost, but we don't really have any of the parameters that drive the location or the amount of these individual points on this curve. And yep, the cool thing is that this is once again injected into our current sort of FFT workflow. So we can adjust or give it an offset. So we could just add it like this. And yeah, this offset will always flatten things out a bit. Let's actually change the motion to something like this. But we can adjust things like spectrum scale to maybe bring some of those waves back. Now, this is giving it a bit too strong, so we can again later on adjust the normals in the material itself until we have something we want. We can rotate the wind direction a bit, but that is independent of the motion, so you can have some really cool sort of surface details going in a direction and then the larger waves going into another. So these are all cool things that you could do, but we thought, well, this is good and all, but this is all FFT simulation. And the thing is that some mobile devices or lower end devices simply don't have the computing power for it. So what can we do to fix this? Well, here we have a brand new control called Ocean Simulation Type. So if we click here, we could go to Gertzner waves. And right now here we have a brand new material called Gertzner waves. Now if we just open it and drag it here, this will come with its own set of parameters. So something that we could do is adjust the tiling a bit. And there we go. We have our regular sort of looking Gertzner waves. Now, something that you may be accustomed to if you're using Gertzner waves is the very obvious tiling. Now, we're happy to report that we're doing some sort of a little bit of fancy math stuff here. And the Gertzner waves are kind of going through our regular FFT pipeline without the hardcore FFT calculations. But we could use tile break on it. So if we go really high, there's still some visible patterns just because of the nature of the waves, but it's a lot less than what you would regularly be getting. And we have some really nice parameters here, so you can adjust the amount of waves we have. Right now we have them to 32. We could go to a lot more if we adjust these parameters. We have something to note is that unlike the FFT, things like height and steepness are done through this particular material. So here we have the maximum height. Right now it's 14. Go with something like 1. So this controls the sort of height of the swells, and this controls the height of like the smaller waves. If we go to 0, a certain portion of our waves will disappear. So to get a little bit of them back. We can go 1, 2, whoops, too much. And yeah, this is a very nice looking ocean at the moment. Next up, we have wind direction and pretty much all the good stuff you're used to with Gertzner waves. But with this little thing, you basically can have as many Gertzner waves as you want. We can go 128. Let's go ahead and adjust this as well. And there you go. You can control the spread. So are we looking for something that's more affected by the wind direction, something a bit more spread out? The distribution, are we looking for larger swells, smaller swells, and so on and so forth. But I hear you say, well, this is all good and great, but this is still quite heavy to process. Well, that's why we have yet another ocean type. Now, if we go to ocean simulation type, we can go into baked ocean simulation. Once we hit this, we are actually getting some really, really nice looking ocean here. So what's going on here? Well, this ocean is a baked texture, and you could see it, the one being used here. Now, at the current moment, we cannot alter these textures with Waterline. This will be something that we'll be working on in the future, so you can kind of bake in the ocean that you have set up with your FFT simulation. But for the time being, we've provided you with 5 different versions. So this is Ocean 1. We could go to Ocean 2. Right now, it might be looking a bit too noisy, so we can just change the normal text adjust to something like 2. And ideally, the ocean resolution should be set to 512 for these. We are losing a bit of detail from our post-processing here at the bottom, that's with the additional noises, but this is what the overall simulation texture looks like. We can change it to something like this. Now, one other limitation is that the foam with these doesn't quite look correctly as it should. And another one is that they cannot be rotated. They're kind of as is. You can adjust the height, the normals, and the speed, but the directionality at the moment is something that's kind of baked into the texture itself. So this is where we're at the moment. And funny enough, some of you may have noticed that this is only halfway through the video or so, because we have much more coming along. So something we wanted to do with our new ocean actor is like, well, we wanted to recreate a bit of a workflow from some of the offline renderers like Houdini or Blender. And that kind of involves layering effects on top of each other. And we thought, well, this is good and all. So for example, we wanted to have a really basic ocean. And for that, let's go with our tried and tested sort of Gertzner ocean. And we're going to open the material. And let's just quickly set something like... So we have something like this. And you're like, well, this is a nice big sort of stormy looking ocean, but we've lost a lot of detail. Is there any way we could bring it back? Well, yes, there is. And this is where we're introducing our next big feature called Ocean Cascades. Now, these aren't exactly ocean cascades, but these are additional simulations you can run on top of the one you currently have. So right now, ocean simulation is our base one here. And if we scroll all the way to the bottom, we have something called Ocean Cascade 2. So to enable it, we're going to say run Cascade 2 and nothing's going to change initially. So what we need to do is open up the Cascade Manager. And this can look a bit scary at the moment, but this is basically a little material function, and we're going to say enable Cascade 2, hit apply. So what this will do is it will recompile a bunch of shaders. This will take a little bit of time. And after everything is good and ready, we pretty much have like a second simulation running on top of this. Now, right now, our tiling is pretty insane. So let's go with something a bit smaller. Well, this is pretty good, but it just broke everything. So let's go with this. And let's adjust our ocean height to something a bit more manageable. And there we go. Now, this is obviously a bit more messy, so let's just adjust the simulation a bit. So for the time being, let's go with something like the Philips spectrum. So things are looking quite good. Maybe we can adjust the tiling a bit. And right now you can see that we're getting some pretty good results. We've got our large Gertzner waves, and we could use that for our buoyancy or foam. And you could see here under ocean buoyancy, we can select which cascade should be used. Right now, our biggest swells are basically what will be causing ships and stuff to move around, so we really want to use this one. But if we want to, we can have them affected only by our first cascade. I mean, this one, cascade number 2. We're kind of adjusting the names here. Second of all, the same thing can be done for foam. Let's enable the foam again and set it to something like, whoa, that's a bit too much. And we can see that foam is being very harshly generated by our current Gertzner waves. But say, yeah, this is great, but it's a little bit too much. So let's have something like our FFT simulation generate foam. And there we go. We have something a bit more smaller and cleaner, just being kind of generated whenever we want. Now these can all be adjusted. For example, we can even adjust this to be a bit more realistic looking. For example, we could just go to our ocean material. Thanks. We could lower it as well. There we go. So these are some nicer looking kind of waves. So for example, here's a really cool example we've quickly set up where we're using the Pearson-Moskowitz spectrum for these really large swells, and then using an FFT for the really small scale waves, thus giving us a very detailed surface with some really cool details. And again, because of our anti-tiling sort of approach, there's almost no visible tiling happening anywhere. Another thing that we can have here is a very low res FFT that's based on the Pearson-Moskowitz simulation here, using, let me see if I can find it. Oops. These sort of parameters here, and it's just being rendered at just 256 for the large swells. And in Cascade 2, we're using actually a baked out ocean texture here for all these little details. So realistically, we're simulating very, very little. And yeah, we can still get some really nice big swells, almost no visible tiling in the distance. And yeah, this is quite efficient to render, as we're essentially just rendering one very low res FFT simulation. And here's another scenario. In this case, we're going for maximum quality, so what we have running is 2 FFT simulations. Again, one low res for the larger waves, and a Cascade 2 at a very high res for all these little details. And a cool thing that this does is that it gives us individual controls over the swells versus the smaller waves. For example, we can go with the large ocean and adjust the ocean height to be 2, 1, so on and so forth. And of course, we will need to be adjusting the normals a bit in our material to account for this, but overall, we have a very fine-tuned control over exactly how we want our ocean to be. And something else you could do, for example, is have some sort of a stylized ocean where you have really sharp peaks that are like very exaggerated, being driven by something like a Gertzner or another FFT function, and then have really realistic sort of simulation for the smaller scale waves like we have in this example. And with a few small adjustments and a few clicks, we now have a pretty much an ocean that is outside the FFT spectrum. Larger swells are generated by these Gertzner waves parameters. Now a little bit of a bug you'll notice is that covering over these parameters will cause a bit of a flicker. This is an editor only, so it's not something you need to worry about. And then for the details, we're using Cascade 2 with our baked ocean simulation. We've kind of bumped up the resolution to be 1K here, so we can get some extra details from our micro displacement parameters here. But there you have it, a very detailed ocean. Because the larger Gertzner simulation is pretty much just used for the swells, we can have it rendered at a lower resolution because we don't really care much about detail there. And yeah, this is now a very detailed and very efficient ocean. And this is where like the real strength lies out in ocean generation 4, is that you can swap out these completely different systems and sort of mix and match them. Now, this is still under development, so if you're watching this, it will be a preview version will be out on our Gumroad store, so you can check it out there and really please test it, but just make sure not to use it for production because it's not quite ready. And yeah, go make awesome things.